This is the Extra Point Podcast. During this podcast, we will dive deeper into our Sunday teaching and share practical next steps for your faith journey. Now, let's kick off the Extra Point.
Hey, welcome to the Extra Point. I'm Cheryl Ross, the Next Steps in Discipleship pastor here at Southridge Church, and I'm with Scott Beha, our lead pastor. And before we dive any deeper, I want to make sure that you like and subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already done so. That way you don't miss out on any new content. So we're continuing in our series, Selfish and Stupid, and this week and the next couple weeks, we're really focusing in on marriage. Yes. And so, Pastor Scott, give us like that little highlight blurb that you gave us about why it's important, whether you're married or not, to focus in on this.
Yeah, the church talking about marriage is important because marriage is the foundation of healthy families. Healthy families are the foundations to healthy communities. Mm-hmm. And so the reason why the enemy attacks marriage is because that's an easy way to attack communities, because we haven't always had our guard up in regards to marriage, especially as far as Christians are concerned. For the last 40, 50 years, there's been an epidemic of us not caring for marriages as we ought to, and so therefore that's where the enemy attacks, and so we have to be really careful of that. And so that's one of the reasons why I said I understand there's single people in our church that are not married, and so if we preach on marriage for 3 weeks, and at one point in my ministry, I really shied away from it. In fact, the last time that we did Selfish and Stupid, I don't know that we really specifically talked marriage, just because I was trying to be so sensitive, like, well, that's not everyone's station in life, and now I've kind of abandoned that and gone, actually, I think everyone in the room should want to hear about marriage, because marriage is the foundation of healthy families, and so there's some truth that has to be spoken in regards to that. And if we want healthy communities, then we want healthy families, and if we want healthy families, we want healthy marriages, and that's what we want to be about. And so that's why we're going to talk about marriage specifically for 2 weeks, and then we are going to dive into divorce and remarriage, simply because on a podcast like this or in any given sermon, if it's not the whole sermon, it's very difficult to get into a topic as complex as divorce and remarriage. So we're going to get into what the Bible has to say about, like, it's not my opinion, it's what the Bible has to say about divorce and remarriage later on in this series. But specifically, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about things that I think that we have forgotten in marriage, because this is the example I gave. Everything leading up to the honeymoon phase after you're married is really exciting. Everything's new. Everything is magical, and everything that the Disney movies always promised you that it would be. But then, like, how often do we see movies where it's like, all right, well, here's Steve and Stephanie 8 years into marriage with 3 kids that are all playing sports or playing an instrument or have extracurriculars, and they serve at church, and Steve has an important job, and Stephanie has an important job, and they have a 2,500 square foot home to take care of and laundry for 5 kids, or like, it's like, like, where's that movie at? The way we can watch Steve and Stephanie almost kill each other for months at a time. Because that's honestly, that's real life. So once that bubble gets burst and life takes over, we start to forget some of the things that we knew, or I guess I should say I presume that we should know. I gave everyone an out on the first point about roles. I don't know that everyone is necessarily in the know of that, given the lack of biblical knowledge in general in society. And that's not like a put down to anybody. We just live in the most biblically illiterate society that's ever existed. They may not know that, unless they've heard some like really unhealthy versions of it that I think should also be rejected. I'll give a caveat. Maybe you didn't forget. Maybe you never knew. But now that you do know, let's not forget. I do know the second point, that marriage is hard work. We forget. Because if you didn't know that going into it, then you weren't properly prepared to get married in the first place.
Absolutely. So in that first point of you forgot your role in marriage, I think there's a lot of times where people, because they've maybe experienced an unhealthy view of this, or people have used this to push views in other areas of life. And so I love that you kind of clarified that. But I think like there was a lot of work to be done of just kind of sharing, hey, before you tune out or before whatever.
Yeah.
So I want to give you space to kind of elaborate on that even more in here in this podcast, because I do feel like there's probably more that you would have to say.
There is, and it sucks that we have to have so many caveats to get into what the Bible says, but it's because people in my position and just men in general have taken the Bible to abuse people over the years, and that's not actually at the heart of the Scriptures, and so it's always been a misrepresentation of the Scriptures when that happens, and so you have to have all these caveats to go like, listen, I understand in modern times we kind of fight against anything that has to do with patriarchy, we fight against anything that has to do with misogyny, and listen, I am all for standing against all of that, to be honest, if it's leading to negative outcomes. But what I challenged second service in, I didn't get to it in first service, what I challenged the second service in was, I don't know that trying to do it our way in modern society is really working.
Right.
We don't see, people are as discontent as ever. So I don't think that pushing our own way and our own agenda when it comes to anything has really worked out really well. So what's to say that we shouldn't go back and see what the Scriptures have to say about marriage and go, well, maybe, since the Christian worldview is that God created marriage, maybe the way that he created it is the way that it's actually meant to flourish. And if we will just get back to that and kind of disregard some of the modern, ideology that we get into, and come to the Scriptures honestly, but also in a healthy way, not twisting them or bending them for our own purposes, to soften them in any way, but just like understanding, like, we know people have gone to Ephesians 5 and abused their wife as the result of it, and that if that's the case, you are not reading Ephesians 5 properly. You might be taking one verse out of context.
Right.
And so we can't have that. We have to look at, especially Ephesians 5 as a whole. And so, there's had to have been a lot of caveats because, men and preachers have used these passages to really relegate women to a second-class citizenship, which that's not what's happening in Ephesians 5. You cannot look at the New Testament and see how Jesus elevated the role and the status of women in first century society that told them that they were less than, and come away with an idea that they are lesser than.
Right. Now,
this is something that I've grown in. I would say probably 8 or 9 years ago, I would have been egalitarian, which means, egalitarianism in most Christian circles, we're talking about that men and women can both lead in every situation equally. I would have probably landed there when I first started in ministry. I have kind of changed in that regards. I still hold egalitarian beliefs when it comes to church leadership, because I still think that the New Testament speaks of women in leadership in that way, and then there's other reasons why I would go on to think that. In regards to ministry, or can a woman be a CEO? Can a woman be president? Absolutely. None of that bothers me. I don't think the Scriptures have anything to say about women not leading. But it does seem that from its inception to me, and this is where I've changed, that God has set an order inside of marriage that needs to be followed. And I don't think that it had anything to do, it didn't, knowing God, it never had anything to do with the woman being a second-class citizen, because she is included in the verse of Genesis 1:26 that we made them both in our image, in God's image.
Yeah.
And so you can't have two people made in God's image and say that one is lesser than the other, but you can say that one complements the other, or that they work well together when they're both playing unique roles. And that's how the church really needs to handle this.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that when we share about the husband being the head of the household, that we share with him what that really looks like, and what it really looks like for the woman to be the helper, because it's not sit down, shut up, I'm in charge, the Bible told me. That's not biblical headship whatsoever.
Yeah.
It just means that you are to take the lead in the home, but that doesn't mean that she doesn't have a say.
Right.
Right, because if you're Ephesians 5 says, we lead by sacrificing. If we're the head of the household, we lead by sacrifice, and we lead for her own flourishing. You can't figure those things out, how to best sacrifice on her behalf, how to help her flourish, if you tell her to sit down, shut up, and not share. Like, she has to come alongside and give input into the decisions that are being made. Now, I'm not saying that every single time you're going to say, okay, yeah, we're going to go with what you say.
Right.
Because sometimes, there's times as the guy we go, I feel God leading me in this direction. You may not be on board yet, but I hope one day that you will.
Yeah.
But again, you're only doing that when you think that you're doing it in her best interest.
Yeah.
If you're doing it because it's your best interest,
Right.
you're misreading the scriptures.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll share from like a female perspective who does hold leadership on the church side. I absolutely love and adore those moments where my husband takes that head spiritual moment, because I do it a lot, like with everyone else I interact with. And so for me, like, it is a way that he does serve and sacrifice for me in that way, like in addition to the other ways, because I know that I don't have to be on in that space, like always, like that I can rely on him to do that in those moments. And it's one of the best things. Now, I know that there are times, like, especially in the New Testament church, like the early church, there were, and maybe you're going to get into this a little bit more later, but where there were times where you start a marriage, right? You go into a marriage, one of you maybe isn't Christian, or maybe you're both not following Jesus, but then the female maybe becomes a Christian and your husband isn't. Like, I know you'll probably hit this more in the marriage and divorce. But I think in those moments, even early on, because we're weeks out from that, remembering that your witness to your spouse, you're witnessing to him in those moments. Yeah. Like, he's not there yet. So in that,
1 Corinthians 7, we are going to get into it in the marriage and divorce week of this series. But 1 Corinthians 7, somebody actually asked me about this 2 weeks ago after the singleness one, because hey, Christians, we marry Christians. And they said, he was asking about that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, like, hey, if Christians always marry Christians, then why is there this passage about how if you're married to a non-believer, how did that happen? I said, well, what was happening in the early church is you've got this new Jesus movement going on. So everyone is pagan, but that doesn't mean that they're not married. There was still marriage in Roman and Greek society and all of that. And so these people are married, and then let's say one or the other of them, if you were in the area of Ephesus, it was probably pretty common for the guy to get saved and the woman to be part of the temple of Diana. If you're in Corinthians, maybe the women were, or in Corinth, the women are getting saved and the husbands are kind of out living a debaucherous life. When that was happening, what would happen? We see this still in very modern examples. The woman gets saved, the man gets saved. The other person is not quite on board with that. But then as people begin to take their faith seriously, that begins to cause issues at home. Because, and this is why the Bible says we should not be unequally yoked. This is why Christians marry Christians. But if you end up in a situation where, well, I'm already married, but then I become a Christian, the Bible does give certain like, hey, if your non-believing spouse wants to leave you, then you're permitted to do so. But if they are okay with continuing the relationship with you, then even though they can't necessarily lead you closer to Christ, you can lead them closer to Christ by actually fulfilling your role, whether that's leader, whether that's helper, and see that as your witness to them for Christ. That, hey, like if you're a lady married to a non-believer, serve your husband, honor him, respect him, and like 1 Corinthians 7 says, that may even bring about his salvation. That may even be the thing that brings him into holiness, is that your willingness to show him Jesus through that, rather than always, wanting to fight, wanting to whatever it might be. Because you don't share values that you used to share, but then this new thing happened in your life. It's a very difficult situation, which is why normally when I'm talking to Christians, or normally when I'm talking about Christians marry Christians, I'm talking to single people. Just like normally when I'm talking about divorce, I'm actually talking to married people.
Right.
Right. Every time I talk about divorce people get so mad at me, and I'm like, I'm not talking to you really.
Right.
What's done is done. I'm trying to save marriages. I'm not trying to make what. If you know me at all, you know I'm not shaming anyone for the things that they've done. So if I'm talking about divorce, I'm clearly talking to married people. I'm trying to save marriages. In the same way, if I'm talking Christians marry Christians, I'm not trying to talk to people that are in situations where you got saved 10 years into marriage and your husband or your wife's not quite there yet. Because then I know the sort of pressure and the stress that clearly I'm not talking to you in that moment.
Yeah.
I'm talking to single people. I'm talking to the 21-year-old that's like going on dates with guys that are not Christians, because you know if you're in that relationship because you got saved later on in your marriage, how stressful that is. Just trying to save people from that. Same thing with the divorce thing. Divorce people, I don't know why you get so mad at me whenever I talk about, because I'm not talking to you in the first place.
Yeah.
I'm not in the business of shaming you for decisions that you've made. I am trying to talk to married people because as divorced people, you know how painful that was. So you should want me to talk about that to that crowd.
Yeah.
That's really what's going on in those situations. I'm normally not talking to the person that's in the pain. I'm trying to talk to the people that have not yet experienced it to try to keep them from the pain that you have experienced.
Yeah.
And so if you're in a relationship with someone that you go, well, my husband's not a Christian. How do I submit to him? How do you submit? Let him be the head of the household. Let him lead. Don't let him compromise your faith. Like, stand firm in your faith. But there are ways that you can honor him and still be true to your faith.
Yeah.
And you need to find ways to do that. Husbands, if you're the one that got saved, your wife is not there yet. You need to find ways that will lead her and honor her. Without, trying to force everything upon her that then will make her resentful. This head and helper designation still works whether both people are saved or not. Now, granted, because God created it, it always works better when both people, which is why you should marry a Christian if you're single and you're a Christian. Because everything, we said this 2 weeks ago, everything in life gets so much more difficult when you choose not to do it God's way.
Yeah, it sure does. And I think that if we can remember that and remember the concept that you just talked about, you're doing this to help people. Like, you're not up here trying to shame people, trying to put condemnation on them or anything like that. You're trying to help them in life and their faith and all of that. And so if we can keep that open mind and that open perspective throughout this whole series, then I think that we will be less offended and more open to what it is that we need to hear, to change, to live out in order to see these healthy relationships and healthy marriages. And
I really don't understand why, and maybe it's because I'm a guy, I don't know, why so many people are turned off by the phrase helper. Especially given like some of the stuff I shared, like God has called our help, our helper. The Holy Spirit is literally referred to as the help. God will send the helper.
Yes, and I love that you dug into that, because I think that it is easy to forget, especially most of it. I would say it is because they have had that negative.
Yeah, you have someone abuse you or something, and you're like, you want to fight against that. I get that, but like the Holy Spirit is called the helper. But we also affirm in the Trinitarian theology that Father, Son, and Spirit are co-eternal, co-equal. And so there's not there's...
Well, and I think that it goes back to what you said at the very beginning of this, that we live in a very biblical, illiterate world right now. People don't know those scriptures. They haven't done the study to understand what that means, what that word means, and how it does align with God and the Holy Spirit. I think that we just don't know what we don't know. But what I will say, like a practical thing in this that I think has been missed for a long time, that I think would be super helpful is, men and young men getting around other men.
Yes.
Like creating those spaces, bringing somebody alongside of you. And I feel like we talked about this maybe early on or maybe in our last series about how we need to be always like discipling and mentoring those beneath us and above us. Like we need
Yes.
people who are further along in marriage than us to get around them, to have those conversations, to talk with. But like, I think that there's been something missed in the way that like a lot of young men, especially, I'm going to say, like, don't always have that community that, or, you know, don't seek that out to where they're not learning these things. Like you said, maybe you never knew. I think that a lot of people have not been in spaces where they can learn these things, see it by example, whatever that looks like. I don't think they're in those spaces to learn it, to then be able to know and live it out.
Yeah, and this should not be lost on us that if you haven't been paying attention, the more that men have not taken the biblical call to their manhood and to leading, that all of that, the decline of that, has followed the decline of Western society in general. And so, and it may just be because I'm a guy that I feel strongly about speaking to guys, but I think the vast majority of our issues starts right there. When you see people like with this, I'm trying to think, what is it? Like almost Arrested Development type situation or failure to launch. Like you see people later on in life waiting to move out of their house, waiting to get jobs, waiting to get married, waiting to get kids. And then like we're raising this like generation of men that's like really passive and they don't mind taking a back seat when it's like that's not what God has called you to do whatsoever. And it's like, you know, if you father a child, like the issue with fatherlessness has also like ran rampant right alongside the you know the degradation of Western civilization. If we don't see this and start to do something about it, this is the way that the enemy has been attacking in the West. And I really do think that if more men would stand up, get a job, and get married, and raise good Christian children, that we could. Everybody wants to see Western civilization make a turnaround. That's not happy with where it's at. I think it starts with the men actually being men. And we stopped this idea of, it got really popular over the last handful of years, maybe the last decade or so, to like criticize men for being men. And I get that. That's because there's been a lot of men that have acted like rascals and done stuff that they shouldn't have done. I get that. But
I think
we need to get back to what the Bible has to say about being a man. And that's not you abusing women, but that is you caring for, cultivating. It's you leading. It's you loving. It's taking that role. It's growing up, which we really need men to grow up in this society. If we're going to see a change, it should not be lost on any of us to see, hey, everyone's upset with the way that the world is going right now, and then you look and you go, fatherlessness is at an all-time high. Failure to launch, Arrested Development. You got people living at home until they're, forever. Like, I'm just sitting in mom and dad's basement in my underwear with my Cheetos, commenting on Reddit. Like, it's just, dude, eventually it's time to grow up. And the failure of more men not to do that, it runs right alongside all of this.
Yeah, I feel like, and maybe I'm way off base, but I feel like some of the feminism stuff that has come out is because of the lack of men doing this. And so we feel like this need of, well, we have to step up. We have to do this, because if we're not going to do this, then who's going to? And I think it's also reminding, like, separating the view that you have of the men who aren't with the men that God really created men to be. Like, like if we can separate that enough to say, okay, we're not talking about the men who have got it wrong. Like, we're wanting men to get it right. And it is our job, I think everyone's job, to help, like, get it there, like to all have that right view or perspective, and separate some of those feelings, some of the past. Like, that's why we started with the planks, right? Because we all have past stuff. We all have that. If we can separate those things enough to view it in the way that God designed it, the way that God created it.
Yeah.
Like, not just marriage, not just whatever, but the way that he designed humans to live and operate.
Yeah.
It was to live in a good way. Like,
Biblical manhood does not result in toxic masculinity, which
Right.
is what the modern feminist movement is all pushing back against.
Yeah.
It's like, but you have to realize that's a really ignorant way to
Yes.
create an ideology, is to take the worst of these and then create a worldview around the worst of these. Because like biblical theology would never lead someone to toxic masculinity. It would lead to biblical masculinity, which means that men will become providers. They will become protectors.
Yeah.
They will be godly examples of Jesus who want to take care of and ensure the safety of those around them. And so, again, modern feminist movement, I do think, filled the vacuum of a lack of men stepping forward. But what they did is they went too far, and they went, well, let's just go after the worst of these, and we'll create a whole ideology and worldview based on the fact that, it's true. Men have been absolute scoundrels, but not all of them.
No.
And so to act as if we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there's some folks that don't get it right. Again, all of this, we can't sit here in 2025 continuing to go on social media and talk about how Western civilization is crumbling for whatever reason and not see that all of these issues coincide with one another.
Yeah.
Like, it's just when you get all of these issues run together too. And I know that we're supposed to be talking about marriage, but when you start talking about the issue of the lack of fathers in homes, when you start talking about how the rise of divorce has led to more and more kids not being raised in a house with mom and dad, which again, it's not to throw shade at anyone that's not your story. And it doesn't mean that if you didn't get raised in a home with mom and dad, you can't be a well-adjusted member of society. It's just the studies show that we need mom and dad in the home for the family to be strong.
Yeah.
And so the way both of them can play their role in your development. And it's no wonder we go out, we decry all the things that are going wrong, but then we're like, we know the answer. We know the foundational answer is to strengthen the family if we want to see our community and our country actually get strengthened. We know the answer, but we want to fight against it because we keep giving bad examples of people that were out there doing things that, no, we're not fighting for that. We're not fighting for women to be abused. We're not fighting for women to be degraded as second-class citizens, not at all. And so you have to look, like with the rise of divorce, the rise of just all of these different social ills that kind of go on.
Yeah.
And how that's led. And then we'll go on social media and go, I don't know what's wrong with the world. It's like, we know what's wrong.
Yeah.
We know what's wrong. It's the enemy trying to undermine the very first institution that God ever put into place. Marriage is God's first institution that he ever made. And when we undermine the things that God has created in the way that he created them, do not be shocked when that's right where the enemy hits, and that's where everything begins to fall apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think back for me, I am one who I was pretty independent for a season. I mean, I still am somewhat independent. My husband and I joke about it all the time because I'm terrible at asking for help to reach things up high. I'm like, I'll just get a stool. It's fine. But from someone who kind of had to be because of the stuff that I'd gone through and who didn't have trust because of the abuse that I experienced and all of those things, the moment that God placed a man in front of me who had this right was the moment that I realized not all men are like that.
Yes.
And so, I think the more that we help guide men to be that kind of man, the more that we'll be able to reverse some of that ideology and some of those things that have been instilled because of that past. And so I think that's why it's so incredibly important.
Yeah. And it's not passive and weak either. We're not saying we need men to be passive and weak.
No.
We need them to be strong. We need them to put on the fruit of the Spirit, one of which being gentleness, meaning that, but gentleness is, we always get this idea that all Christians are gentle and mild and meek. And it's like, no, God is a warrior. He is a fierce defender of those that are in need around him. Like,
Yeah.
That's the model that biblical men should be following.
Yes.
A provider, a protector, a priest, someone that's leading people towards God. That's the role that men. And so it's not this modern version of these weak and passive men that are like, oh, it's okay, you go and do your thing, like you go ahead, boss mom or girl boss or whatever, and I'll just come and hang out in the background. No, that's not biblical manhood. Step forward, get your crap together, take care of your family, be strong, but be loving and sacrificial at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. I think that we have to remember that you can be strong, but loving and sacrificial at the same time.
That's Jesus.
Yeah, and I will say again, like I wanted that. I was looking for someone who was strong, who I knew would protect me, who I knew whatever. And I think that there are probably a lot of people out there who are also looking for that. And I think that for the woman, if you can put yourself aside and your own views of everywhere else and everything else aside for the moment to realize like you will see you want this in your man too.
Yes.
Like and I think that some of the tension comes in marriages when that's not happening, because then it's like, man, I'm doing all this. Like if I'm the girl boss, I'm doing all this outside the home. The last thing I want is to come home and have to do it at home too.
Yeah.
Like that's, if you will think for just a moment, I think you'll see that too. And I think that's where, it does come back to the, and I'm not saying we're all right in that either. Like I know a lot of times we have to set ourselves aside and realize where we're getting it wrong too, that with his best interest in mind, we are going to show him the respect and help him get there.
Yes.
Like there are ways that like if my husband is not doing the things that like what we've been talking about,
help him to see it, but in a way that is still respectful. Exactly.
Like in a way that still honors him.
Undermining him and constantly criticizing him will never bring about the change in your marriage or in your husband that you want to see.
Yeah.
And so as hard as I can be on guys, I would be equally as hard on women who try to usurp power in a relationship rather than try to help their spouse find the role that they really need to play through encouragement rather than the constant criticism of, man, why can't you ever do anything right? Why I want you to do this. Why can't you be more like so-and-so? Like, and there's plenty of women that are like that as well, and they should be equally as called out as weak and passive men should be. So that was point one. I know I want to hit some like rapid fire application for point two, so the way we don't miss that.
Yep. Point two is marriage. You forgot that marriage is hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we went to Revelation chapter 2, the church in Ephesus. Jesus is giving this like commendation and then a condemnation almost, where he says you're really hardworking. You know, you have good theology, good doctrine. You don't tolerate the poor teaching, but you're really busy, but you have lost your first love. And this is a picture of what happens in almost every relationship. See, for the Ephesians, as soon as they got busy in ministry, they lost their love for God and for each other. And in relationships, as soon as we get busy, we end up minimizing everything that got us to the place where we began. Like, so for instance, with the people in Ephesus, they got busy serving and holding to the truth, but they stopped doing acts of service and love for God and for others. Right? They were like so consumed with this one area that they were neglecting everything else. And it was like, what did you do when you first got saved? You read your Bible, you prayed, you wouldn't miss church, you were inviting people, man, I found this church, God's really moving. And it's like once you go through that for a couple of years, like the fire dies out in people, and it's like you've been at this church for 10 years now and you haven't invited someone to come with you. You haven't felt the move of the Spirit in your life in a decade, but yet you're still going through the motions. You don't realize that you're Ephesus. The same thing happens in our marriages. Like whatever it was that got us to the altar, when we stop doing that, it does. I said it Sunday. It feels like you're married to someone that you didn't actually marry. Like if he is all romantic and spontaneous, well-dressed, well-groomed at all times, he's always wanting to talk to you. He always wants your attention. But then you end up married to a guy that's a workaholic and you never see him. The last time that you are on a date, you can't even remember when that was. And if you do get time together, he's sitting there on his phone or playing video games and doesn't have time to connect with you because he just needs to decompress. You start going, where did that person go that I married that was spontaneous and courteous and wanted to communicate with me? It feels like you're married to someone else. And it's the same thing for guys. Like when girls are trying to get into the good graces of guys, whether it's right or wrong culturally or politically, they always put their best foot forward. Ain't nobody getting into a relationship and wearing sweatpants every day of the week. I'm sorry if that feels, they're just not. When you're in the dating phase, the sweats only go on after he drops you off. Right? And he's always only seeing that. And I'm not saying, okay, you had a long week, he come home on Friday, you're home, you got the sweats on, it's been a long, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, how are you still putting in the effort, though, every once in a while? Like, hey, y'all are going out on a date. Maybe you could take some time to show him, hey, I'm still the same person. I'm not the exact same person because we're always growing and life is always changing us and the situations of life. But like, hey, that person's still here. You're still married to the same person, right? Like, so it's the same thing. Like, we just stopped doing, like, maybe you used to be really into the things that he was into. Like, you or at the very least, you pretended really good. Oh, I'm into it. I'm really into this. And then when you get married, it's like, no, I never really liked that in the first place. And you go, well, like, you used to be like this, but now you're not like this, and now it feels like I'm married to somebody else, and that's always creating these tension points. And so it's just some, like, rapid-fire things to make sure that the drift doesn't happen in your marriage. You have to have date night. And I know that so many people live disconnected from other people, so they don't have any relationships where they can trust people with their kids. You got to fix that.
Yeah.
That can't just be your excuse. Like, oh, well, we don't have anyone to watch our kids, so we don't ever go out on dates. Nope. And you can't go, well, we're really broke, so we can't go out on a date. Who says that you can't? Who says that you can't put the kids upstairs and go sit on the back deck for 2 hours?
Right. Yeah.
I'm not saying do that with a baby, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like,
no.
Who says that you can? There's cheap ways to have dates.
There are.
Little
Absolutely.
Caesar still has $6 pizzas. You can go get a $6 pizza and go sit at a state park for free.
Yep.
There are ways to so whatever your excuse is, it's not good enough. You have to connect. It's the same thing. If you didn't hang out with God for 6 months, how would your relationship with him be? It'd be horrible.
Yeah.
And if you don't hang out and talk to your wife or your husband, it's the same thing. You have to, date night has to become non-negotiable.
And here's what I'll say too. On date night, don't make it all about work and the kids and stuff. Yes, you can have some date nights where you maybe you have a date night where literally you're just planning out your calendar.
Yeah, you got to work out some stuff.
You got to do that. Okay. But I'm talking about you should have some where you're still really focused on each other.
Yeah,
and so my husband and I, one time I just went into Google and pulled up some questions, questions for date night for married couples is what I did. And there were several blogs with all kinds of questions. And that was one of my favorite dates that we've had over the past year was that I did that. And I got to learn a couple new things about my husband, and we've been married for 13 years. Yeah. So
have fun with each other. Yeah. It doesn't have to always be serious. Go play paintball.
Yeah.
Go or take turns doing stuff that the other person is into, but you're not into it. Okay, if you got a husband that's into sports, go to a sports game, even if that's not your thing. But then don't forget, if she's into the ballet or something, you need to join along. Date night has to become non-negotiable in your house. Yes. And I'm just going to say that if you have kids, getting away from your kids overnight, I'm not talking about just on date night, overnight, at least quarterly, should be a non-negotiable for you. It just should. And you go, I don't know how we could ever make that happen. Make friends. Make sure that you have friends that can be trusted. That's really easy to do if you are connected to a church in a small group. You can find good, godly people that will watch your kids because you all need time away from your kids, not just 2 hours on a Friday night. Yeah. You need to spend the night with no kids. And if your kids sleep in the bed with you, you've got to get your kids out of that bed, period. There's no room in the marriage bed for anyone other than the two people that are married. We're going to talk about intimacy in this coming week. This is one of those things also. In the honeymoon phase, right after you get married, intimacy is at an all-time high for most people. And it doesn't take long for life to get busy, our bodies start to change as we get older and all of this stuff, that intimacy starts to bottom out.
Yeah.
What we're going to talk about this coming week is you don't realize that it's physical intimacy that actually God created to help bring two people into one. And it's the glue that sticks everything together. And I will promise you this, the vast majority of unhappy couples are not having nearly enough physical intimacy. Like when I do marital counseling, when we get to that, hey, when's the last time? It's like 3 years ago, and you go, yeah, it's not shocking.
Yeah.
Like that you're in my office if you haven't touched each other in 3 years. Like it's downright wrong. Like the scriptures actually speak against this.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's what you need to get the fire going again.
Yeah.
And I get it. Some people, oh, you don't understand my past, or you don't understand what's happening in my body right now. I don't know that you understand how serious God talks about sex in the scriptures and how big of a deal it is for your relationship. Because if you're not doing, like if you used to, hey, as soon as we got married, it was like all the time, and now it's like quarterly, it's no wonder you got marriage issues. You cannot try to do something that God designed in a way that he did not design it. And he designed that to be one of the central pieces of your relationship. And so whatever it was that had the fire burning early on in your relationship, or whatever it was that got you to the altar, you have to get back to doing those things. You have to schedule your life in a way that you have time for these things. Because this is what everyone tells me when I'm doing counseling. We just don't have time to have a date night. Our kids are into too much stuff. Well, guess what? Your kids are not the top priority in your marriage. After God, your spouse is. So if your kids are into too many things for you to go on a date night, tell your kids no. Tell your kids no. They will honor and respect that later on in life, even though they won't like it in the moment, because they will realize, I'm trying to care for your mom, and your mom's trying to care for me.
Yeah, and I think it's so super important for your kids to see that also and recognize what it looks like to be in a healthy marriage and a healthy relationship. I think there's too many marriages that, and you know, dads, moms everywhere that are not doing the things that can really show and give that example to your kids, to your daughters, to your sons, of what it looks like, of what it looks like to respect your husband, of what it looks like to love your wife, of what it looks like to put them first. Like, I don't think it happens enough. And so then we end up in this cycle where then, you know, the kid grows up, gets married to someone, and it's a lot like their parent.
They don't know how they're supposed to be treated.
Because,
they never saw it.
Yes.
It's funny. I will gross my kids out at home. I don't care.
Yeah.
Like I'll tell Landon all the time. I'll say, hey, Landon, dude, your mom is hot, and he hates that. He hates that, but he will get it one day.
Yes.
He'll get it whenever it's like, listen,
Yeah.
after almost 13 years of marriage, sorry, my anniversary's on my wrist. I am still like attracted to your mom. I'm still like head over heels for your mom, and we make sure that happens in front of them.
Yes.
Like the flirting, the hugging by, the kissing goodbye, that happens in front of them.
Yep.
Period. It's like, that's just, because I want my daughter, I want her to know how someone should treat her. So I take Olivia on dates. When I take her on dates, I treat her like she should be treated whenever she gets to the age where she should be taking people on dates. And Megan will take Landon on little dates to help him understand, this is how you take a woman out. This is how you treat a woman. And we do it the right way. So you got to, everything in marriage has to become more intentional. And I think that's one of the reasons we just forget. We forget, and when we forget, there's drastic consequences. Yeah,
absolutely. So, very good. We will be right here again next week with another deep dive into how you can make your marriage healthier, and giving you some more practical next steps for your faith journey.
Thanks for tuning in to The Extra Point. Be sure to subscribe to the Southridge Church podcast and tune in every Wednesday for another episode of The Extra Point.